So, guys, I want to talk about AEW, and there is that recent controversy with John Moxley getting hit by Spike and, flesh peeling off his body. And there's some people that are talking about that the big issue with AEW is that, they focus more on shock value and violence instead of story. And I do want to talk about why I feel AEW doesn't focus on story. That I think the first thing that we have to understand is that yes, there are many times they've actually told really good stories. And I think the best story they ever told was MJF versus CM Punk. Swerve versus Hangman is also up there. And recently, I like the story of Ricochet, from somebody who, was treated like a goof. And people were just saying he's a butt of everybody's joke to. He wants to win a title. He wants to do, by any means necessary, gain something. So I think we also have to understand, and then also time was Tony Storm versus Mariah May. So we got to understand that yes, they can be very successful stories. So I know we got to break that stereotype. Yes, they've done good stories, they've done like compelling stories, but I really think that one of the big reasons why they don't tell stories is that they may have a mentality of, what WWE is story based, so we're gonna be counter WWE by not having stories, and I think that's one of the big issues. And the problem is that it's like what people said, that there are a lot of people who are very critical of professional wrestling, and they have the mentality that every single time you do something violent or something crazy, it's always better with context. And like I've always used the example of Pulp Fiction. Like, for example, like the reason why it's such a great movie is because there's a lot of twists and turns. There's a lot of like shocking violence in it, but it's all just, backed by a really, really good and developed story, but I think that it creates an expectation from the audience to be like, hey, well, since there's good storytelling and wrestling everywhere, imagine how much better AEW would be if they focused on really great storytelling and it really upped the violence and really upped the emotions and all that. So I think that the first argument is they don't want to be like WWE. The next argument is, Tony Khan wanting to do what he wants, wanting to be in charge of everything. So I think that maybe Tony's almost like, I don't want to tell a story, or I want to tell stories that I want to tell. And usually if you have a bunch of like, people in the writing room, sometimes, if somebody has like a fantasy booking, like I did a fantasy booking of Anthony Bowens this year, and I would have him face MJF and become a big star. I did a fantasy booking this year of Powerhouse Hobbs beating Chris Jericho for the ROH title. I did a fantasy, I do have an idea of a fantasy booking for Kyle Fletcher to beat Daniel Garcia. So the problem is that when you have people who have good, good like fantasy bookings or storylines for people for a couple of months, it really takes away his power, really. So, or he may give him the mentality of, oh no, that's a good idea, but no, I'm going to do what I want to do. So you may have like a chef that cooks a really bad chili, and then you have everybody else that knows how to cook like really great baked goods. He doesn't want to turn into a bakery. He wants to do what he wants to do. And I think that that's a very strong, mentality of, maybe Tony just doesn't want to do it, and maybe he doesn't care to do it. And maybe he's almost like, AEW is successful financially in his eyes, so he doesn't care about expanding it or growing it. So he may just want to just hold on to power, and he may just have the idea of, I don't want things to get better, really, because, like, whatever AEW costs to run, it's not an issue for him, either because of his own personal finance or because of, maybe he makes enough from the profits of AEW and also the profits of the other companies that his family owns. I think the next thing is that the writing room doesn't have a lot of expectations. And I've said this many times, that they said the writing room has over 30 people, and that's very, very horrible. You do not have a writing room with 30 people. It should be 10 people for AEW Dynamite, 10 people for Collision, 10 people for Ring of Honor, and then you take maybe your strongest writers, and that should be 8 people, and then one person, Tony Khan. That'll be 9 people, and then those people are gonna do the pay-per-views. Because when you have way too many writers, it becomes a clusterfuck. And sometimes, what happens if you have a few strong writers and then you have a bunch of mediocre writers. And then Tony said that one of his philosophies is that, if there's an idea, everybody has one thing that they want and get achieved with it, So it's almost like I said, if I did a fancy booking of Anthony Bowens, there may be a bunch of people that may say, hey, well, we don't see the star power in him, when I see a lot of star power in him. So if I was in the booking room, they'll be like, hey, don't book Anthony Bowens, and and that's going to be what the majority wants. And I'm going to be like, oh, well, now I'm in a writing room with a bunch of, just, pardon my language, retards or assholes or dumbasses that just want to do what they want to do. And it reminds me of that episode of Family Guy where Brian was trying to make a television show, and he had a really great idea, and then James Woods and other people just said, hey, we're gonna do what we want to do. And that happens a lot in writing rooms. Or I've done filmmaking, and sometimes you may have an arrogant actor or arrogant people be like, hey, no, we don't like your idea, or we're gonna do what we want on the film set and just take it over or do what we want. So that does happen a lot in writing rooms. So sometimes I think that they don't have a standard, and they're not kept to a standard, and I think that it's not developed in a way for people to flourish. And sometimes I wonder what happens to people who have really great ideas if they're allowed to have more creative control and be like, hey, you know what you're talking about. We're going to keep your idea. We're not going to have other people edit your idea. And I think the next issue is the AEW locker room. There's stories of people having sensitive egos. There's stories of people just wanting to do what they want to do, really. Or, Tony just isn't a good leader. I think that a lot of things that I see with the Moxley faction is, one thing is that Adam Copeland does not like to get pinfalled. So, what would happen if I have a really great short-term, story of Christian becoming the AEW champion and beating Adam Copeland for it? What would happen if I say to myself, hey, you know what, let's use Ricky Starks instead of Wheeler Yuta? What if I said, hey, you know what, why don't you put Pac in the in the World's End tournament, and other things like that, so you can have a locker room that's well, hey, fuck you, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do that. Or you can have a locker room that's let's say if I was writing the story of Will Ospreay versus Kyle Fletcher, and let's say I set it up to something where they both had a fear of heights, they talked about fear of heights, and I said that the final spot is going to be the Spanish Fly off the ring cage, and then they're like, no, we're going to do what we want to do, or they continue the match on their own, really, and Tony's okay with that. That also could be another concern, is that maybe you have wrestlers that will do what they want in matches if you book it, or you say, okay, well, this is the story you need to tell, this is where you wrap things up. Or you may have wrestlers that look at your script and you may have something really good, and they'd be like, hey, we're not going to do this because either we're insecure and we don't want to do your great idea, or we just want to do what we want to do. And those things, those can be actual issues. And then you have Tony, who's way too friendly, and he's gonna be like, hey, I'm gonna side with people who want to do what they want to do, really. Another big issue that I think that this is gonna be the final thing, is really that they just do, and I think that people have said this, they don't really have week-to-week meetings. And I understand why they don't do that, because that's just extra work. Or Tony Khan is super busy, but he wants to have all the power, really. So he may be like, nah, I just want to do what I want to do. And that's why I don't continue a storyline. And then also, you look at what happened with the with Stone Cold Steve Austin versus Owen Hart. I think they said they had over a year story that they had, but Austin could have broke his neck, really. And that could have gone down the drain, really. So what would have happened? You look at somebody like Adam Cole. He got a long-term injury. So What if they had a lot? What if you have a wrestler like Adam Cole and they had like maybe a year or 2 years of great story, and they got that all done really. Now somebody's injured, so I understand why people don't do that, because they're like, oh well, you just have a really great idea and then now it gets thrown down the drain. Or you know what, somebody like Tony Khan's so busy that he's gonna just have really quick meetings and feel like, hey, you know what, that's enough really, instead of just, saying, hey, well, that's not enough, because there's a great line about Stanley Kubrick, like some people like working with him because his philosophy was, you don't move on to the next thing, you hold up everything unless you just know how to move on your story, like in A Clockwork Orange, when during like during the home invasion scene, they didn't move on until somebody came with the idea of singing in the rain, because Kubrick felt that was enough. Or in Full Metal Jacket, he was very meticulous about making sure that everything was perfect. And then there were some scenes where he wouldn't let the actors move on to something else because he wanted to create the tension of people feeling like, the actors feeling like, okay, the Vietnam War was very drawn out and people wanted to go home. So he's not going to he's going to do multiple takes to make them feel that same way of they're in an endless war, or they're just in an endless situation of never really going home. So, that's, so yeah, but the reason why most people don't do that is because sometimes, it is frustrating to be stuck on something. Or, I've had parents, who are like, if I don't do my homework right, they'll just make me redo it. Or sometimes, I can like write an essay for, elementary school or middle school, and it can be 5 pages, but they'll be like, okay, you're not submitting it. You have to rewrite it again because you have to work on the grammar. You have to make sure it looks neat. Or sometimes, like I've told people about what happened to me in middle school, where I had a teacher that had me rewrite a paper 30 times, and my dad actually had to call the school and tell her to stop doing that because she wanted me to live up to my potential, really. So the problem is that sometimes I can understand that frustration of, well, somebody doesn't want to do weekly meetings, or somebody doesn't want to like focus really hard on an idea, or sometimes people may say the idea is not good. Let's just sit down and brainstorm, and nobody's allowed to leave the room for a few hours. Nobody has an idea really, or they don't use AI or whatever to help them out really. So I can understand that they just want to have that freedom of people wanting to do what they want to do really. And I understand, like in psychology, there's people like Tony Khan. I'm not sure if he was bullied in his life. I'm not sure how Shad raised him, because Shad could have been a spoiled brat really, or he could have been somebody with a lot of expectations. And when people have a lot of expectations growing up, they can feel very, very powerless. Or they can be like, okay, you know what, I worked really hard. I stayed up 5 hours writing a paper for school. And then their parents are like, no, you don't. I'm going to tear up that paper. We're going to write like more drafts. We believe in your writing and we want you to do better, really. And then they're like, angry and frustrated. Like, oh, well, you know what? I don't like having potential. I don't like being like forced to redo things multiple times, really. Or, like I remember like, when I was in high school, I was mad with my father because he wanted me to study for a history test. And I already knew everything on it. Like, it was almost like if somebody told me to recite my ABCs, and then I was able to do it, but they said, oh, well, practice all night, really, when you know the answer to it. So sometimes when you have people or parents that are so stubborn about, studying way too much or rewriting things or being very meticulous or overworking their kids, then they can grow up to be adults that are like, no, I don't want to, focus really hard on something, or I don't see the point, or it's drawn out really. It reminds me of the episode of The Simpsons where Milhouse was Radioactive Man's sidekick. I think it was Radioactive Boy or whatever, and he's like saying, you know what, we practiced it, like 100 times. It's done. And then their person grabs it by the arm and says, we got to do it from different angles and everything like that, really. So, so he may have that feeling too of just saying, you know what, when I say it's done, really, because I don't want to be overly focusing on it, or I want to go at my own pace or my own like momentum, really. So I think that's also another big issue with AEW is that, Tony may have the mentality of he wants to have, freedom over his projects. And that also means not developing stories or not working on stories to make it better, or maybe they don't have good ideas, so they don't like watch the fantasy booking videos or whatever, or like they don't want to lose power, or people just don't want to give up power because they don't want to feel powerless, or maybe they're just, sensitive about people who may be more experienced. So all these could be theories of why, they don't work on writing in AEW.